So if it's your first time on a Tuesday night, we have been for a while, you want to know that we're in the middle of a new series, and the series that we're in the middle of at the moment is about stories, myths, symbols. It's about approaching the Dharma through the more mythical and story side of things. And we'll be doing that series for about a year, something like that. And during the series, we have all these little mini-series in them, if you see what I mean. And the mini-series that we're in at the moment is based around the stages of the spiritual path, also known as aspects of the spiritual path as well. Because here they're kind of laid out as if it's in a nice path. You sort of start here and work through. But of course, real life isn't like that. So these are stages, and we'll go through these stages of our spiritual development all the time. Okay? It's not like you start here year 1 and by year 50 you're kind of down here. It's kind of like these things just keep going. And we're particularly looking at the stage of integration. Integration linked with the practice of the mindfulness of breathing and mindfulness. And Vidania spoke last week about integration, a particular aspect of it. I'm going to talk about another aspect tonight, and then I think there's at least a couple more talks around integration and what it means. So, okay, so in terms of integration, if we're honest about ourselves, we find that we are actually, if we look at ourselves, we'll find that we're like a collection of different impulses and different urges a lot of the time. Sangharakshita, who founded the Triratna Buddhist movement, said it's a bit like we're just a whole collection of impulses tied together with a name and an address. That's kind of our identity, but we're all sorts of, we want to go in all sorts of different ways. So for me, one part of me wants to be really fit and go swimming a lot, and another part of me just wants to stay in bed. Doesn't want to do that. So they're like conflicting impulses. One part of me's got this kind of dream of living in seclusion in the countryside, a kind of like, semi-hermit life. Another part of me thinks, oh, I'll move to the LBC in London where it's really, there's loads of stuff going on. There's kind of, tension there. One part of me thinks, oh, it'd be lovely to throw myself completely into the Triratna lifestyle and be in a community and right livelihood and all that kind of stuff. Part of me goes, oh, need to think about privacy, security, what I see as security, all that kind of stuff. So tension there as well. And in a way, all these different parts of ourselves will often lead to discomfort, to a sense of tension in our experience. So it's a bit like we're pulled in all sorts of ways by these different parts of ourselves. And I think integration for me means becoming more wholehearted. It's like a word that I've not really understood, actually. It's very good that I start thinking about it a bit here. So what does integration mean? And to me, it's a kind of sense of wholeheartedness. The more of ourselves that we can put behind something altogether. And also that sense of pleasure. When we are wholehearted in something, it's a pleasurable feeling. It's enjoyable. We can drop all those kind of, oh, I should be doing this, I should be doing that, and we can put all ourselves into something. So this, for me, this stage is about developing a sense of wholeheartedness. Okay, but today, I'm going to be telling a cautionary tale. It's a sad story, and it's what happens when we're not integrated, actually. When parts of us are all over the place. And I'm also going to talk about how the practice of ethics can help us to become more integrated, more whole, more wholehearted. And the story I'm going to tell it's a modern story. It's from the 60s, and it's from Visantra's book. So Visantra is an order member in the Triratna Buddhist movement. I think he lives in Cambridge now. He's recently come back from spending 3 years, 3 months and 3 days or something on a retreat, most of the time practicing on his own. Before he went away, he wrote this book, which is all stories. So if you like stories, it's a great book, I'd really recommend it. And the story I'm going to tell about someone called Donald Crowhurst comes from this book. Though actually I'd come across it before, just got integrating actually, because I thought, oh great, part of my old life, which I used to go sailing, which is what the story's about, and Buddhism has kind of come together, which I really liked. Okay, so this is the story of someone called Donald Crowhurst. There might be a picture of him. There he is. And in 1968, Donald Crowhurst was in his 30s. He was living in Somerset, and he was married. He had 4 children, 4 young children. And he ran a business that made the electronic parts for self-steering equipment for yachts. For people who go out sailing for pleasure. But his business was not doing at all well. It was heading for the rocks, in fact. It was like things were going badly downhill for him. And he was under a lot of stress. And what he used to do for pleasure is he went sailing. He was a weekend sailor. He went sailing up himself. And I think something really important to understand about him is he was kind of upper middle class. So he had certain expectations about how you should live. Like, for him it was really vital that his 4 children got a private education. And that he lived in the kind of lifestyle, where you did go sailing at weekends and things like that. That was very much a part of his conditioning, how he thought he should live. But anyway, so his business wasn't doing well, and he went sailing. And at that time, in the late 60s, there was a lot of excitement around people who went sailing on long journeys single-handedly. Francis Chichester had recently sailed around the world, and he'd stopped on the way, but he'd done it all the way around on his own. And there'd been a lot of excitement about that. Thousands of people had come to see him arrive in port. And the Sunday Times thought, this is really like catching people's imagination. What we'll do is we'll set up a race with serious prize money, which is a race for the first person to sail around the world without stopping single-handedly. And there was going to be 2 prizes. One prize was you were the first person to have done it. And the second prize, if you were the fastest person to have done it, you got £5,000, which I looked up in a calculator, and today it's worth about £75,000. So quite a serious prize you'd get if you actually managed to do it. So quite a few of the people who were really into sailing at that time decided they'd take part in the race. The people who'd done a lot of long-distance sailing. And so did Donald Crowhurst, even though actually he hadn't really done a lot of sailing. But I think he saw it as a kind of way out, and also a way to publicise the technology that he'd been developing as well. So he decided that he was going to sail in the race, and he started getting ready for that. He bought himself a boat, and he got some support from a local businessman to pay for the boat, which was a quite sort of advanced technology boat with 3 hulls. And the person who lent him the money, or gave him the money for the boat, said, if you don't come first, if you're not the quickest round in this boat, you'll have to give me the money for the boat, okay? So he's already in a bit of a problem, okay? The business is going downhill, he hasn't got any money, and he's already got himself in a situation where if he doesn't go fastest, he thinks he's got to give the money back for that boat. And he also got himself a publicist, a PR man. And the PR man thought that the story of Donald Crowhurst, of this kind of amateur, could make a lot of money in the press. So there was already this kind of vested thing that he needed to be telling a good story, and he was trying to get himself a lot of press coverage as well. Okay, so in those days, to sail around the world now single-handedly is pretty amazing, but in those days it was even more amazing. And as I said, I've done some sailing myself, kind of in a limited way, and I've sailed across the Channel. And that was really scary, on a little boat, with other people who knew what they were doing. We had loads of great equipment. Because in those days, when you sailed around the world, you didn't have satellite technology, so you couldn't keep in touch. You had a radio, but if the radio went down, that was it. And you didn't have the kind of weather forecasting that we have now. Like they didn't have GPS, all the kind of stuff now which makes sailing a lot easier, they didn't have. And one of the people, in fact, the person who won the race in the end, Sir Robert Knox Johnson, he said his advanced weather forecasting was he'd look at the barometer on the wall of the pub, and that would tell him what the advanced weather was. That was as far as it went. Whereas now, if you go on a little boat, you'll kind of get all these like electronic stuff will come through with charts and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I'm kind of digressing. But what I'm trying to give the picture of is that it was a big thing to go and spend 9 months at sea on your own, which is what they were setting off to do. So, Donald Crowhurst got his boat, and it was a boat that was kind of controversial. A lot of people thought that boat's just not right for the kind of weather, the kind of waves that he'd be sailing into. And his preparations were very late and very disorganised. Everybody had to set off on the race by the 31st of October. So you could set off earlier if you wanted, but he had to set off on that date. And he set off with the boat, the deck of the boat covered with junk and stuff. He hadn't put away the electronics, he hadn't sorted himself out at all. And in fact, he got a little way out into the sea and had to immediately turn back and sort out a technical problem. So things weren't looking good when he started off. However, he kept going, and actually 9 people started the race. Within only a few weeks, there was only 5 left. 4 had to drop out. So you can see that it was, it was a difficult thing that he was setting out to do. But he gradually dropped behind all the other people until such time as some of the other people were way down in the south of the world, down sort of near New Zealand, and he was still going across the edges of Europe. Now then, I can't remember what my pictures are, but I think I might have an image of the route. Yes, I don't know how well you can see this. Because going around the world is a bit of a kind of weird thing in a boat. What you do is you go from Plymouth, you go down, round the bottom of Africa, and then you go underneath Australia, underneath New Zealand, and then round Cape Horn. And Cape Horn is very close to the Antarctic, and the weather is terrible. It's renowned for being just the most horrific weather. Huge storms, huge waves. And you spend quite a lot of time down there, and then you come back up and you go back into Plymouth. So that's the route of the round the world race. So, okay. So poor old Donald Crowhurst is out in the ocean somewhere, and he realises that that his boat is leaking. Okay, there's a lot of water coming into his boat. All those people who said it wasn't the right kind of boat to use, they were right. Okay, it's the wrong kind of boat. And he didn't know what to do because he's still up here. He hasn't gone yet into the Southern Ocean where there are these huge waves. And also in the Southern Ocean, you're on your own. You're a long way from lots of other shipping, a long way from lots of people. It's a really that's a very risky place to go. If he'd gone into the Southern Ocean, he thought the boat would sink. What's the next picture of what it might look like in the Southern Ocean? Oh no, that's with his wife. There we go. The opposite of that. Okay. So I don't think I think that's like an artist's drawing of what it would have looked like. Okay. But it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard if you get caught in any kind of wild weather down in the Southern Ocean. And so he wasn't sure what to do. Did he have to go down and face that and probably drown, basically? Or should he go home? He could have opted out of the race. But if he opted out of the race, he was going to lose quite a lot. He was going to lose money, and he's probably going to become bankrupt. And he was going to lose a lot of face as well. So he was really worried about what would happen if he went back. But what he started to do, and nobody knows why he started to do it, is he started to draw up a false log. So in the boat, he was keeping a written log of his position every day, of his route where he was. And he started to draw up a false log, which represented what might have happened if he had actually been sailing further on down. Do you want to just show his actual? Yeah, so that's his actual route. So he never went any further than down here. So everybody else set off around there and around the world. And what he ended up doing was spending loads of time kind of hanging about here in the Atlantic. He took himself out of the shipping routes, so no one would see him. And he just kind of wallowed about, not sure what to do, not talking to anybody, and writing a false log. So every day he'd write as if he'd kind of done some amazing sail that day. And in fact, one day, and he still had a radio then, so he radioed those back to his press agent. And one of those days, he theoretically had the fastest day sailing that anyone ever had in a day. Did the most miles in that day. So there was quite a lot of fuss, but the Sunday Times was really excited, was covering it. And the radio message was coming back to him, this is really exciting what you're doing. But he was just making them up. And in fact, I think his press agent also kind of embellished them and made them sound even better than they were. So he was there, and it was kind of like he's writing this lovely log, and he's sending the stuff back to home. And his situation's kind of getting worse and worse, because soon somebody's going to realise he hasn't really been around the world, and the longer he keeps doing it, the worse it's getting for him. So what he decides to do is to pretend that his generator is broken down, which means that he'll be out of contact, of radio contact, okay? He can't run his radio without his generation. So he sends a radio message saying, oh, I'm a bit worried about my generation. If you don't hear from me, it'll be broken down. That will be the problem. And then he goes completely quiet. So that means he's on his own, without even the radio, without anyone to talk to at all. He's getting pretty isolated as well. And he stayed out of contact for 3 months, okay? At one point, he even had to pull into an Argentinian port, which is here, which is completely against the rules, because it's a non-stop race, okay? You're not meant to do that. But he kind of managed to get in there, re-equip his boat, mend his boat so it stayed afloat, and come back out again. And he thought that no one would really have noticed him. He would just be like another person doing that if you know, there was no press fuss made about it. Okay. So, after 3 months, he knew where everyone else would be, and they'd all be kind of coming back up this way. So he kind of went down there, and then he started making his way back, and he turned the radio back on again to see what was going on. So he hasn't really done most of the race, the difficult part of the race. He's just managed to kind of turn around and kind of keep going. Yeah. And he is on the radio, he turns it back on again, about what's happened to his competitors, which is quite interesting. So the next picture. So this is somebody called Bernard Moitassier, who was one of his competitors, is a Frenchman. And I think he's great, because what he did, he was winning the race. He's a very experienced sailor, but he decided he really hated the commercial side of the race. He didn't want to go back to Europe because it kind of made him feel quite sick. The thought of going back to Europe made him feel sick, and he really liked sailing. So even though he was in the lead and he could have won a lot of money, he just kept sailing around the world. So he actually did it. He did it 1.5 times and finished off in Tahiti. Which I just think is marvellous, you know, anyway. The kind of opposite, sadly, of Donald Crowhurst. Yeah. So he dropped out. Robert Knox Johnson, who won the race, ended back in England, but he'd done a very slow race. So he'd already gone back, been heroically welcomed, but it had been slow. So there was every possibility that it looked like, according to the false log, Donald Crowhurst would come in faster than him. And there was one other person left in the race. So by that time, there was just 3 of them left in the race. The person in front of Donald Crowhurst, when he started getting the radio messages saying that Donald Crowhurst was going so fast and making such good time, panicked and started really pushing his boat. And he pushed his boat so much that he got caught in a storm and the boat sank and he had to be rescued by a helicopter. So he was out of the race. So that meant that Donald Crowhurst was now looking like he was going to be the person who came in fastest. And that's really not what he wanted. Because that meant everything he'd done, there'd be loads of publicity for him. What there was going to be was, when he came into port, there was going to be a hero's welcome with the Navy and a flotilla of boats and a helicopter and the press and the TV, and he'd be welcomed back and taken in a limousine up to London to have a dinner with Francis Chichester. It was just like the full-on stuff. But of course, as well as that, some people would be going through his logbooks and looking at what he'd done. And there was every chance that the people in Argentina, when he'd called in there, would remember that this was the same person who just had all this stuff in the press about him. So actually for him, finding out that he was going to probably be the fastest, in theory, was the worst thing that could have happened. Yeah, so he didn't really know what to do, I think. I think what happened was that he started to drift into a type of madness. Some of the time he was really depressed, some of the time he was in some kind of a deluded state where he was writing long things about the sort of meaning of life, bringing in Einstein and God, and he's kind of developing these huge, great manic theories. And at the same time, often being very depressed. He had a very kind of, I think in retrospect, moving talk with his wife by radio, where he said to his wife, is everything okay at home? Are you managing okay? And it could be perhaps read that he was trying to say to his wife, say no, everything isn't okay, and that you need to come home straight away and drop out of the race. But his wife, of course, said, no, it's fine, you keep on going with the race, you keep going with what you're doing. So a few days after that, radio contact with him was lost, and people went out to look for him, and a freighter found an empty boat, just floating, still heading up towards Plymouth actually, but with nobody aboard. It was chaos aboard, and there was the log of what had actually happened was on board as well. So presumably Donald Crowhurst either committed suicide or he fell off the boat, and it's probably more likely that he committed suicide. So too much for him. This huge lie that he had told, this whole untruth, this whole story just got too much for him. Yes. Which is, I mean, it's just a tragedy, isn't it? It's a tragedy. Robert Knox Johnson, who was given the prize money, gave the money to his family so they could keep their house, which I think is really lovely as well, actually. But for the Crowhurst family, it was a tragedy. The heroic figure was now someone who had been a cheat, who had set out, I suppose, to defraud the world in some ways. So for all of us, hopefully, the consequences of our actions are not that huge, okay? That was a real catastrophe that happened to him. But I sort of feel like the tragedy of his story is one that could happen to any of us. Because it's a bit like he just gradually slipped into living this lie. You know, it's just like, and the more he got into it, the harder it was to get out. It just sort of has that feeling almost of a Greek tragedy. It's like, how could he have stepped out at any point? And yet if he had, it would have probably been okay. If he'd said, look, I've made it all up, I've just been drifting about in the ocean. Well, it might have been hard, it might have been very humiliating, but he'd have still been alive, and he would still have been able to do something. He'd have still been a father to his children. He'd have still been able to do something with the rest of his life. So, for me, this cautionary tale, I resonated with it a lot, actually, because I kind of really know that desire to want to tell just a little bit of a story, just to make things better. And actually, sometimes I tell quite a big story to make things better. So I was thinking about 30 years ago, roughly, when I wrote my university dissertation. And I did a piece of research. And I collected all the statistics. I interviewed lots of children. And I collected loads of statistics. And then, for a reason I can't remember now, I decided it was too much bother to actually really properly analyse the statistics, that you could see, you could see from them just where they were heading. I was going to kind of make it up, which I did. I made it up. And it was such a hassle. Because once I started then trying to tell a story that made sense but wasn't too true in terms of statistics, it just took me hours to work out. It would have been easier, I think, to have just done the truthful thing. And kind of the story I tell now, because I can't remember why I did it, but the story I tell now for myself is that at that time, amazingly enough, to get statistics analysed at the university I was at in Manchester, you had to go and get these cards punched, and you had to kind of go to this huge, great room, building, full of whirring things, big whirring things, and men in kind of short-sleeved shirts, you know, with pens in them. And you had to give them your cards, and if you got it wrong, you wouldn't know for a few days, and then you'd have to come back and do it again. And the story I'm telling myself now is kind of going, oh, well, I found it really difficult to do statistics. That was why I decided I'd enter into this fraud, but I don't know, I can't really remember. But I do remember sitting in my room kind of going, oh God, how do I get all these figures to look like they're true? Yeah, and the sad thing was not only to have that hassle, but after the dissertation, my tutor, who I just, the lecturer anyway for that course, who I really admired her greatly, and she really liked my dissertation, and she wanted to talk to me about it, and I was just like, I felt so full of shame and so kind of full of fear that she might realise that I'd made up statistics, that I couldn't engage with her. And it was such a shame, because it was like, it's what I'd wanted all that years. I really wanted to get to know her really well. She started coming towards me, and I was like, oh, I can't do this, I can't do this. So it was the consequences of it were quite strong. Yeah, because it's kind of that feeling like when we do build up this story that isn't true, well, I feel a lot of shame, I feel very defensive, and I feel quite alone and quite unhappy, actually. It's like the consequences of not telling the truth, well, they affect me quite strongly. And it's still something that, I find myself doing all the time. It's not like now I suddenly don't do it, and hopefully not as dramatically as that. But it's still there. I'll still find myself, someone will ask me something, and I'll go, oh yeah, that's sorted. And I think, I don't think it really is sorted, actually. And I have to go away and sort it. And it's just so quick. It happens so quickly with me. And I think the sad thing about those little kind of, almost like when I do that, is where they could lead to, if you were unlucky, a bit like Donald Crowhurst was. If you weren't able to step out from it and go, oh, look, actually, what I said before wasn't exactly true. And, yeah, it's really sad where they can go to. So, yeah. I don't know what the next picture is. Let's see. Yes, these are the 8 worldly winds. They're slightly different, actually. The 8 worldly winds are a model that traditional Buddhism uses to help us steer a steady course through those difficulties of the world. So there are 4 pairs, which are pleasure, pain, fame, distribute, or infamy, it's called something, praise and blame, and it's not normally called success and failure. What's the one? Loss and gain. Okay, so it's kind of similar, isn't it? Yeah. This is what happens if you just take a picture off the internet and try to develop it properly. Let it be a lesson. Yes, so normally we talk about loss and gain instead of success and failure. But actually I quite like success and failure because there's a lot more in that as well. So, let's look at each of those, and let's look at them in terms of Donald Crowhurst and his story. So first of all, praise and blame. Now for many of us, this is like a really big one, okay? Wanting people to say nice things about us, really wanting that, trying to second guess all the time so we can do whatever it is that will make people say nice things about us, and then really hating it if anybody ever says anything bad about us. Even though, of course, in life that's bound to happen, isn't it? But, you know, just like, that can just be a really nasty pair to be in the middle of. And I think that Donald Crowhurst, he got himself in a bit of a corner. He got himself in a bit of a corner because he decided on this boat with its 3 hulls and all the electronics that didn't work. And, you know, if he'd had to step out of the race because his equipment in the boat didn't work, he'd have had all those people saying, told you so. And that kind of image he had of himself as someone who's very self-reliant and adventurer, that would have had to be destroyed. And I wonder also if he was anxious about praise and blame from his wife and his family. I think, you know, he kind of got himself really stuck with that. That if he came back and became, lost all his money, had to go become bankrupt, what would happen to him in terms of how his family saw him? Another one that I think really worked for him actually is success, failure, gain and loss. So he had a lot to lose and he had a lot to gain. And he was really driven, I think, by his fear of failure or his fear of loss. That he was going to lose, he was going to become bankrupt, his children would have to go leave their private schools, a whole lifestyle, a whole way of living would be changed for him. And for us, we might see that in terms of the kind of things we want to gain in terms of material possessions, resources, money, and we might think about the loss we have, the fear of loss we have of losing our possessions, our income, our house, and other things that matter to us. Okay. Then another one is fame and disrepute, or fame and infamy. And apparently, actually, he wasn't particularly worried about fame. So that whole thing about kind of coming back with a kind of flotilla and being welcomed as a hero, that wasn't why he'd done it. But I think he was really worried about infamy, really worried about disrepute, because if he had said, actually, it's all been a lie and I've just been hanging around here, you know, going into port and stuff, he would have really been given a hard time by the press. He would have had a lot of infamy. And most basically, I suppose, there is pleasure and pain. And actually that underlies the other pair of the opposites. Because pleasure and pain goad us through our everyday lives. So every day we're responding to pleasurable experiences and unpleasurable experiences, to painful experiences. It's a bit like our nervous system is kind of responding to stimuli all the time. And we want more pleasure, and we grasp after it sometimes, and we want less pain, and we push it away. So all the time we're being blown around by pleasure and pain, just in our everyday lives, every minute. And if we let them, these 4 pairs can stop us from ever being at peace, because we're just pushed and pulled all the time. It's like our little boat that's ourselves is just blown about by those winds, and we never know any peace. That's why equanimity is in the middle, because equanimity is the peace of actually being able to let those winds blow at us, but we can handle it. And I suppose no wonder we're unintegrated, because if we're always moving from pleasure to pain, if we're kind of going after that and running away from that, we're never going to be able to steer this steady course, because we're always going to be led astray or running away from something. And these winds, of course, are out of our control quite often. You know, we can't control whether people like us or not, whether they praise us or not. We probably can't control whether we're famous or not. We can't control whether whether we're successful or not, or whether we have. Sometimes, you know, it's just kind of quite accidental that we have gain or we have loss. It's nothing to do with us. But the worldly winds only blow us about because of the way we respond to them. Okay? So we could, if we had equanimity, we could live in a way where we might get some gain. That would be fine. But we wouldn't crave more of it. And we might have some loss. Everyone will experience loss in their lives. That's okay, that's painful. But we don't find ourselves desperately trying to push away from it. So we could respond differently to the worldly winds. And you know, you could see it in Donald Crowhurst. There are points where things could have gone differently. So maybe the night before he set off, he could have said to his wife, "The boat's not prepared, I can't do this. We're going to go bankrupt, but let's go for it." Or, when he was out, he realised his boat was leaky, he could have said, "Boat's not up for the job. After all, lots of other people have dropped out of the race as well. I'm just going to drop out of this race." That would have been possible. And he'd been healthy, he'd have been young, he could have had a whole life ahead of him. Okay, so here we are, we're blown around by these different winds. And if we want to become integrated, if we want to become a person of integrity, what we need to learn is how not to be blown around by them, how not to be buffeted by pleasure and pain. And I suppose ultimately the way to do that is to become like the Buddha or other enlightened beings and to see through the whole idea of having that there isn't a fixed, unchanging self. Okay, when we can see through that mirage, that illusion, and it's that illusion of having an I that means that we're always craving, we're always pushing away, that we've got such endless self-concern. If we can see through that when that illusion vanishes, well, all those urgent demands for praise, for blame, for gain, for loss, they will disappear. They'll just fade away. Because there's nothing to protect anymore. If we see reality as it really is, if we are interconnected with the world, if we lose this sense of a special little self that's me that I need to protect, we no longer need to worry about being blown around by those winds. However, we're probably still some way from that. And meanwhile, we can use ethics as our as the way that we can steer ourselves. We can use ethics as a compass to steer ourselves by. So, ethical precepts can be a shelter for us. So let's have the list of, okay. So that Panchasila just means 5 precepts, and these are the negative precepts. So hopefully everyone will have come across the precepts on a beginner's course. And they are in negatives: I observe or I refrain from killing any living beings. And I put this up, actually, this is in India, it's at Lumbini, and the kind of translation's a bit dodgy, but I just really like the fact that it's... yeah, so it's about, as you will know, they're training precepts. We do them in order to develop ourselves, to become more skillful, to act more in accordance with reality. The precepts are absolutely not sent by God. They're not commandments, and if we break or don't live up to the precepts, we're not going to get punished. Okay? Nor if we, if we're very good, we act very good, nor will we get rewarded in heaven. Okay? It's much more of a kind of natural process with precepts, because if we skillfully act in accordance with precepts, what will happen is we will be acting as if we are enlightened, and we'll be acting in accordance with reality. And so therefore, if we act skillfully, we will naturally become happier. If we act unskillfully, well, we will experience suffering. It's as simple as that. So I think when we're practicing the precepts, it's really important to remember that this is not a kind of you're going to be punished or you're going to be rewarded thing at all. It's a kind of natural unfolding of the law of karma. And I've also got the precepts. So if we find that we're being blown around by these worldly winds, we're really wanting praise and not wanting blame, we're really wanting success and not to be a failure, we can use the precepts as guidelines of how to behave. They can help us in those moments of decision when we're deciding what we should do. And in the case of Donald Crowhurst, the fourth precept, which is with truthful communication, I purify my speech. This is about truthful communication. That would be, it would have been really helpful to him. But it wouldn't have been helpful to him if he'd just taken it as a commandment, because he'd have cracked under the pressure. You know, if he just thought, oh, I ought to be truthful, because that's what everyone says, which he probably knew anyway, he'd have cracked as soon as there's a bit of pressure. That's what we do. It's only if we see truthfulness, the sort of fundamental significance of truthfulness, that it will help us. Because actually, if we deceive others and we deceive ourselves, it will naturally cause us suffering. We can't be integrated, we can't be wholehearted, we can't be entire, and we can't be free if we're distorting our world. So if we're habitually untrue to ourselves and to others, we'll be encouraging and developing a lack of integration, because we'll know at some level it's just not true. It's just not true, okay? So we're trying to hold this whole story, like Donald Crowhurst did, of something different about ourselves to what's really going on. That will cause us suffering. And actually, we'll also have to use up loads of energy to keep up the deceit, to keep it going. So falsehood is disintegrating, truth is integrating. And in fact, truth is actually probably the most powerful factor for consciousness, integrating factor for consciousness there is. And I've just lost my place. Okay. Because we think of mindfulness as being integrating. Mindfulness is where we bring ourselves together. But actually, if we kind of investigate mindfulness and think what it is, mindfulness is the awareness of the truth of our experience, moment by moment. So when I'm aware, when I'm mindful, I pay attention to what is there. I'm not caught up in illusions or fantasies, and I'm staying with the truth of what is actually happening. What's happening in my body, what's happening with my emotions, what's happening in my mental states, and what's happening with my environment. And in the mindfulness of breathing, when we're bringing awareness to our breath, what we're doing is we're finding out, we're experiencing what is it really like to breathe right now. Not what is my idea like of what it is to breathe, or what was it like to breathe last time I sat down to meditate, or even what was it like to breathe last time I had a breath. What we're doing is we're allowing ourselves to be aware of the actual truth of what it really feels like, the sensations of breathing in that moment, without the ideas we might have about breathing. And my own experience is that when I'm able to settle into that awareness, I find it much easier to become concentrated. All the kind of hindrances drop away when I contact with what's really going on, my actual experience. But mindfulness, awareness, also has an ethical dimension to it. Because after all, a good bank robber would probably be very mindful, okay? If you're going to commit a crime, you're probably really in that moment as you put on your balaclava or whatever, you've got to be in there doing that. So a bank robber, we can do things unethically, very mindfully. So we really need to have an ethical awareness, and that's what mindfulness means in Buddhism. Sometimes it's represented as it's just kind of being in the moment, okay? And that's really not the kind of mindfulness that we talk about. We're talking about mindfulness which is definitely being aware of the moment, but also has an awareness of where that moment might be leading. What might be the consequences of our actions in that moment. And this ethical awareness of this ethical awareness in mindfulness can have a very powerful effect on our future. Because you can imagine that our awareness, our consciousness, is like a stream. And it's got like a momentum which is born of our past actions. So what we're experiencing now is the consequence of past actions. If we want to grow in the future and become bigger in the future, have a brighter future, what we can do is we can act skillfully now. And on that basis, our future consciousness will be more positive. So in a way, Buddhism is slightly different from some kind of ways of looking at, Western self-development, which can be very much about looking backwards, looking for what was the problem in my childhood or whatever that caused me to be like this now. And that's really helpful, that's really useful. But what Buddhism can do for us is actually it can encourage us to look to the future. So we don't need to worry too much about what caused why I feel like I do now. Even if I feel really grotty now, and full of anger or anxiety, in a way it doesn't really matter where it came from. What matters is how I respond to it now. And that's the ethical sense of mindfulness. It's like, how do I respond to my experience right now? Because that will affect my future experience and my future consciousness. So, if we find ourselves in a sticky situation, someone says, have you written the report? Someone says to me, have I written the report? And I go, no. Okay, no, I go, oh yes, you'll have it on your desk in the morning. And I go, oh God, how am I going to do that? Actually, in that moment, if I make a decision to say, yes, I have written the report, I am creating a limited consciousness for myself in the future. I'm creating suffering in the future. If I'm able to stay with the painfulness of having to go, no, I haven't written that report, and I can handle that pain at that moment, perhaps the blame or the failure in that moment, I'm actually going to be setting up positive states of mind for myself in the future. So that's why the precepts can determine, or do determine, our future. If we act skillfully in line with the precepts, we will be bigger people in the future. We'll have a different experience in the future. All those times when, of course, we don't manage to act skillfully, well, they will create suffering for us in the future. But, I think in practicing like this, it's really important to kind of let go of much guilt or kind of feeling bad about yourself as you can, because that really won't help. To kind of just go, okay, here I am, right now, let go of whatever has caused me to be like this. What I can do is I can decide how I react to it. And in fact, if we can let go of guilt, we'll be able to react more skillfully, to won't be all caught up in ourselves, kind of in that situation. Okay, so mindfulness, I think, has this forward-looking aspect to it, this ethical aspect to it. Okay. So, if like me, you've got a bit of a tendency to perhaps not always tell the truth, how do we go about developing truthfulness? Well, we're going to be full of all these false logs, okay, masses of them, because there's so much we think we've got to protect. I think it's just part of being a human being, We'll have kind of had all sorts of conditioning, all sorts of things, and there's loads of stuff in all of our experiences and inside us that we just think we can't tell anybody, can't tell hardly anybody anyway. So one of the ways to write the true log, to let go of defences, is to tell somebody. And I'm sure you've had this experience of where, like, I've had things inside me that I just thought, they're so horrible, I can't tell anybody, and they kind of fester away in the darkness. And then I bring them out and I tell them to somebody, and they go, yeah. and I can almost see it kind of like it's like a little demon that just goes, and there's kind of nothing left. It's just really amazing. It's like bringing out these things that to me have seemed so bad and I've been really anxious about, and I can just let go when somebody else knows them. And it's interesting, like, sometimes, for instance, on my ordination training retreat, we did quite a lot of practice of hearing people talk about things that happened to them in their lives, talking about unskillful actions they've done. And I'd hear people and I could see they're so kind of upset about something, and they say it, and I think, it's really not that big, It's kind of like, and we could hear that from each other. It was really helpful to realise that all of us have been unskillful many, many times. It's part of being a human being. So developing friendships where we can tell the truth about ourselves is a really important practice. And I suppose being in a sangha like this, where hopefully to some extent we can start to be more truthful. It's a slow process and we're not going to all tell all our secrets straight away, but we can gradually start to do that. And I think that really helps us to be kind of less ill at ease. Okay? Just more relaxed. This is how I am. It's fine. So we can definitely become more integrated and more wholehearted by telling our secrets to people. We can become more integrated by mindfulness of breathing. It's a classic practice. And actually integration is in all the practices. It's there in positive emotion as well. We act in accordance with ethics. We gradually train ourselves to act like we are an enlightened being already. So we act as if we're enlightened. And I think basically it's about what we need to do is to keep a true log of where we actually are. To stop as much as possible of creating these false stories that we then tell the world. And then hopefully we can actually sail our way around in a steady course going where we want to go.